Officer Brent Maddox is on trial for misconduct, but he isn't worried about the charges. He's angry about who's presiding, a black woman, Judge Vanessa Rhodes. From the moment he walks into the courtroom, his resentment simmers. He doesn't believe someone like her should be judging a man like him. As the trial unfolds, his anger builds. Until one day, in front of a packed courtroom, Maddox snaps. What happens next shocks the entire city and exposes a system that's protected him for far too long. But when the mask slips, the truth is far worse. And Judge Rhodes, she's not backing down. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The marble pillars of the Charleston Federal Courthouse stood tall beneath the thick morning clouds, the sun struggling to break through as if it, too, was reluctant to witness what the day would bring. Inside, tension moved like humidity, slow, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. Courtroom 2B hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Staffers who had no business there found excuses to stay. Reporters filled every designated row, their phones silenced but ready. Bailiffs stood just a bit more alert than usual, eyes flicking toward the defendant's table whenever the man seated there made the slightest move. Judge Vanessa Rhodes walked the East Corridor with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through nearly 2 decades on the bench. Her robe was folded neatly over her arm, her heels clicking in a rhythm that said she'd measured every step. Not because she needed to, but because people like Brent Maddox expected her to stumble. She passed 2 clerks whispering near the stairwell. They fell silent the moment they saw her. She didn't acknowledge them, not out of rudeness, out of practice. Inside the courtroom, Maddox sat with his arms folded across his chest, legs spread wide, like the defendant's table was just another patrol car seat, and he had every right to be there. His suit didn't fit properly, too tight in the shoulders, sleeves just a little short. His lawyer leaned over and murmured something in his ear. "You need to keep your mouth shut today," the lawyer said, not quite loud enough for the microphones to catch. "No grandstanding, no comments. Just let me handle it." Maddox smirked, didn't look at him. "Funny. You act like I'm the one on trial here," he muttered. "You are on trial," the lawyer snapped quietly. "This is serious. One more outburst, and you could tank any chance of avoiding jail time." Maddox rolled his eyes. "If she was a real judge, we wouldn't even be having this circus. She's got a damn agenda." "Brent, I said what I said." The lawyer leaned back in his chair, clearly realizing words were wasted. One of the bailiffs across the room shifted slightly, hand near his holster, watching Maddox's posture as if reading the curve of his spine for the moment he'd spring. Even without saying much, Maddox carried the kind of energy that made trained men hold their breath. The door behind the bench opened, and the room drew still. Judge Rhodes stepped in, the black robe now flowing over her frame with deliberate weight. She didn't look at Maddox. She didn't need to. She scanned the gallery, acknowledged the court reporter with a subtle nod, then sat with a stillness that made the wood creak beneath her feel almost disrespectful. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Rhodes picked up the gavel and brought it down once. The sound echoed like a warning through the room. "Good morning," she said. "We'll continue with the testimony from yesterday. Is the witness ready?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor responded, standing as a woman approached the stand. The forensic analyst took her oath, adjusted the microphone, and began recounting the evidence. Data, inconsistencies, radio logs that didn't match Maddox's report, timing discrepancies that painted a different picture than what he'd submitted under oath. She spoke carefully, measured, but the implications were devastating. Maddox's version of the story had holes, and they were starting to widen. He shifted in his chair, muttering under his breath, but loud enough for the front row to hear. "Lies," he hissed. "All of it." The judge's eyes flicked down toward him. "Mr. Maddox," she said calmly, "you'll remain silent during testimony." He leaned forward slightly, voice low and bitter. "With all due respect, Your Honor, how am I supposed to sit here and let this happen?" "You're here to listen," she said without pause, her voice neither sharp nor soft, just certain. "Your counsel will have a chance to cross-examine shortly." Maddox smirked. "Sure. Like that'll matter." One of the bailiffs took a step forward. Rhodes raised a hand, not to silence Maddox, but to halt the officer. She didn't need backup. Not yet. The prosecutor continued, asking about the recovered dash-cam footage and inconsistencies between the audio logs and the body cam submission. The analyst explained how sections were missing, likely edited. Maddox stared at her, jaw clenched. "She's guessing," he said louder. "She wasn't there." The judge leaned in just slightly, still seated. "Mr. Maddox, I won't tell you again. You will not interrupt this proceeding. If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed." That shut him up, but only on the surface. His eyes locked on Rhodes now, not in deference, but in challenge. There was something unsettled about his stillness, something that hadn't been there yesterday. His fingers tapped against his thigh. His foot bounced once and stopped. His breathing had changed. Judge Rhodes saw it. She didn't show that she saw it, but she did. And what she felt in that moment wasn't fear. It was preparation. She had seen this kind of quiet before. Not the kind that settled a room. The kind that waited for a spark. The witness stepped down. Rhodes glanced at the clock. "We'll take a 10-minute recess," she said. "Cross-examination will resume afterward." The gavel struck once more. As the courtroom emptied in low murmurs, Rhodes remained behind the bench for a moment, her eyes lingering on the man at the defense table. Maddox was smiling now, but not like someone amused, like someone who thought he'd already won something. She rose and walked back to her chambers, her expression unchanged. But beneath the surface, her mind was already working through every variable, not just because Maddox was dangerous, but because men like him always believed that fear would bend the rules in their favor. And if he was planning to make his move, he hadn't yet realized who he was facing. The courtroom filled slowly after the recess was called, but the weight inside the room had changed. Where there had once been idle curiosity, reporters scribbling notes half-heartedly, bailiffs half watching the gallery, there was now the quiet pull of unease, like the air itself was waiting. The kind of tension that didn't come from anything obvious, but rather from something under the surface, something that hadn't happened yet, but felt dangerously close. Maddox was already seated, unmoved since the last gavel. His hands rested on the table, but his fingers twitched every few seconds like they were searching for something to hold. His lawyer returned last, tightening his tie and glancing at his client like a man who had already lost the argument 3 times before lunch. "You're going to answer nothing more than what's asked," he said in a low voice as he leaned in. "Let me do the work." Maddox didn't even look at him. "She thinks she's clever. She's a federal judge," the lawyer said. "And if you don't keep your mouth shut, she's going to bury you without lifting a finger." Maddox snorted. "We'll see." When Judge Rhodes returned, she moved with the same steady pace she always did, her robe brushing behind her as she walked. She took her seat, nodded once, and looked out over the room like she was measuring the temperature before speaking. "You may proceed with your cross-examination," she said, eyes landing briefly on the defense table. The lawyer stood. His questions were sharp, measured, and clearly rehearsed. He tried to undercut the forensic analyst's earlier claims, pushing back on timelines, questioning the data interpretations, hinting at procedural gaps. But none of it landed with the weight he hoped for. The analyst remained composed, her answers unwavering, and every attempt to discredit her only seemed to highlight the steadiness of her testimony. Maddox didn't like it. He began shifting in his seat, mumbling things under his breath that no one could quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Resentful, angry, personal. When the analyst referenced the body cam edits again, Maddox let out a dry laugh that echoed in the quiet room. Rhodes looked down from the bench. "Mr. Maddox, I'll remind you once again that you are not to interrupt." He turned slightly, loud enough now for everyone to hear. "I'm not interrupting. I'm reacting. There's a difference." The judge didn't blink. One more remark and you'll be removed from the room. That is your final warning." He leaned back, arms folded, a smile flickering across his face like he'd just heard a joke no one else understood. The analyst stepped down. The next witness, a sergeant who had filed a formal complaint against Maddox years earlier, was called. As the man took the stand, a few heads turned in the gallery. This part hadn't been expected. Even Maddox sat up a little straighter. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Sergeant Diaz, you filed an internal complaint in 2019. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what was the nature of that complaint?" The sergeant shifted slightly. "It was about Officer Maddox. I documented a use-of-force incident I believed was excessive. I also reported that the body cam footage he submitted had been tampered with. I was later told that no action would be taken. Do you recall who reviewed that footage?" "I do. It was processed by the same internal affairs investigator who later resigned in 2021. Maddox shook his head, muttering again, "This is garbage." Rhodes gave him a sharp glance. "Mr. Maddox." But Maddox was already moving forward in his seat. "No, come on, this is a joke. That man hated me. Everyone knew it. Now we're going to act like he's some honest broker?" "Mr. Maddox," the judge repeated, her voice firmer now. "You are out of order." The sergeant hesitated mid-sentence. The prosecutor raised a hand, signaling for pause. "I should have known," Maddox said louder now. "The moment I walked in and saw who was sitting on that bench. This whole thing was cooked from the beginning." The room tensed. Reporters began writing faster. One of the court officers took a half-step forward, but the judge raised her hand again, stopping him. "You want to talk bias?" Maddox went on, laughing now, but it was a hollow, bitter sound. "Let's talk about yours, Your Honor. Let's talk about how every decision you've made has had one goal. Take down the white cop who doesn't bow. Isn't that it?" "Mr. Maddox," Rhodes said again, no louder than before, but now with a calm that felt almost surgical. "This is your final opportunity to compose yourself." He stood. The gallery gasped. The sound of a chair scraping back on polished wood shot through the room like a gunshot. "You think I'm scared of you?" Maddox snapped. "You think because you wear that robe and sit on that bench, you get to judge me? I've bled for this city. I've worn the badge you people spit on. And now you want to humiliate me in front of cameras?" Rhodes didn't move. "Sit down." But he didn't. He took a step forward. "You don't get to sit there and act like you're better than me. You never did." The bailiffs began to move, quietly, but quickly. The gallery froze in collective dread. Maddox's lawyer stood, arms out. "Brent, sit down now. This is not the way." "You stay out of this," Maddox barked, turning sharply. "I should have handled this my way from the start." And just like that, Rhodes saw it. The shift, the hand dipping toward the inside of his coat, the tension in his shoulders snapping into something final. She didn't speak again. Not yet. Because what Maddox was reaching for wasn't a word or a defense or any last attempt at dignity. He was reaching for something else entirely. And the room was about to find out. There was a sound, soft, subtle, but unmistakably out of place. A rustle of fabric, the metal-on-metal click of something sliding free. The kind of noise that would have been meaningless in any other room. But here, in a courtroom where tension had been building like pressure in a sealed drum, it cut through the air like a blade. And Judge Rhodes knew before she even saw it. Maddox's hand came out of his coat. Fast, but not panicked. Practiced like a man who had rehearsed the motion. In his grip was a matte black handgun, small but heavy, no doubt chosen for concealment and impact. It rose into the air with a slow, deliberate finality, as if the weapon had been waiting just as long as he had. The room didn't move. Not at first. Gasps rang out, sharp and broken. A scream from the gallery, quickly silenced by instinct rather than bravery. A reporter dropped her pen. The court clerk inhaled sharply and froze mid-motion. Bailiffs stepped forward, hands near their weapons, but stopped just as quickly, their eyes flicking to Rhodes, then to Maddox, calculating the worst-case outcome in real time. Maddox took another step forward, raising the gun and leveling it directly at the bench. "Don't move," he said, voice low, but louder than any voice should have been in that space. "Nobody move." Rhodes did not flinch. She did not lean back. She did not reach for her panic button. Her hands remained on the bench, her chin slightly lifted, her gaze locked on his. "You brought a gun into my courtroom," she said evenly. Maddox sneered. "I brought the truth. The part you people keep trying to silence." "Put the weapon down," one of the bailiffs ordered, his voice shaking slightly. "Shut up!" Maddox snapped, turning toward the officer, weapon swinging just a few degrees before snapping back to the judge. "You think I won't use it? You think I haven't been pushed far enough?" Rhodes kept her voice level. "You've already lost, Mr. Maddox. Every second you hold that weapon makes it worse." "No," he said, pacing now, walking slowly in front of the bench like he was reclaiming ground. "You don't get to tell me what's worse. You sat there behind that desk, judging me, mocking me, pretending like I didn't serve, like I didn't bleed for this badge. And now you want to call me the criminal? You made that decision," she replied. "You weren't forced. You think this trial was justice? You think this wasn't rigged the moment they put someone like you in that chair?" There was silence. And then Rhodes spoke, not with anger, not with panic, but with the kind of quiet that made people listen. "You're afraid." Maddox stopped moving. His jaw clenched. "Excuse me," he said. "You're afraid," she repeated. "Afraid that without the badge, without the gun, without the uniform, there's nothing left. You're not standing here for justice. You're standing here because you lost control of a story you were never strong enough to tell honestly." He raised the weapon a little higher. "You think I won't do it?" She looked straight at him. "I think you already did. The moment you pointed that gun, you proved every witness right. You didn't lose your job because someone targeted you. You lost it because you were never meant to wear the badge." "Shut up," he barked, but she didn't. "You think this is strength? Holding a room hostage? Waving a gun at someone who won't flinch? This isn't power, Mr. Maddox. This is collapse, and I'm not going to help you dress it up as anything else." He stood there, breathing hard now. His eyes flicked around the room. Every movement, every whisper, every shift of a foot made him twitch. His finger hovered too close to the trigger. He looked at the gallery, at the rows of people frozen in their seats, at the bailiffs who hadn't drawn their weapons because the risk of a bloodbath was too real. He looked at his lawyer, who was still standing with his hands up, whispering something that no one could hear anymore. And finally, he looked back at her. "You really think you can break me with words?" he asked. Rhodes didn't move. "I don't need to break you. You've already broken yourself." That did something to him. His face twisted. Not quite rage, not yet, but something bruised and frantic beneath the surface. The mask was starting to slip. He turned slightly, facing the gallery now, gun still raised. "Everybody on the ground. Now!" There was movement. Controlled. Slow. Terrified. People slid from their benches, journalists shielding their cameras, attorneys ducking their heads, court staff sinking behind desks, eyes wide and limbs trembling. One of the bailiffs moved toward a panic button under the desk, but a single glance from Rhodes stopped him. Not yet. Maddox stalked toward the well of the courtroom, waving the weapon like he wanted someone to challenge him, like the only thing worse than losing control was not being recognized in the loss. He stopped near the jury box, empty during this bench trial, and turned back to the bench, his face flushed and sweating now. "You think you can talk me down," he said, almost laughing. "You think that calm little voice is going to save you?" Rhodes sat forward slightly. "No," she said. "I think you're too far gone to listen to anyone. But the people watching this, every camera in this room, every person out there who thinks you're just another cop caught in a bad moment, they're listening. And they're seeing you for exactly what you are." He opened his mouth like he was going to scream again, but this time nothing came out. Outside, unnoticed, Detective Carla Nguyen stepped through the front doors of the courthouse, SWAT team already gathering behind her. moving up the stairwells in coordinated silence. Their boots made no sound on the stone steps. Their weapons were ready. Inside, the courtroom held its breath, all eyes on a man with a gun and a judge who would not move. And the standoff had only just begun. The courtroom didn't feel like a place of law anymore. It felt like a sealed chamber, air growing thinner with each second, every person inside locked in an unspoken agreement not to make the wrong move. Maddox stood like a man untethered, eyes darting from one corner to the next, as if he could see cracks forming in a foundation only he understood. And Rhodes, still unmoving behind the bench, watched him like a surgeon studying a patient mid-collapse. Steady hands, sharp eyes, and no room for fear. "You hear that?" Maddox called out suddenly, the gun still raised. "That silence? That's the sound of a room full of people finally shutting up and listening." No one answered. He turned toward the gallery again, toward the lawyers crouched behind benches, the reporters huddled behind the front row, the court clerk silently praying behind a desk. One of the camera phones that had been hidden earlier was now pointed just above the rail, recording every word. "I spent 10 years putting animals behind bars," he said, pacing again, his steps echoing. 10 years chasing drug dealers, gang members, liars, and not once did anyone in this damn building say, "Thank you." But the minute I get accused by some criminal looking to shave time off their sentence, suddenly, I'm the villain. Judge Rhodes let the pause settle before speaking. "You weren't accused by a criminal," she said. "You were accused by a pattern." He stopped. She continued, her voice steady, just loud enough to carry. "Over a dozen reports, multiple complaints, edited footage, lost evidence, and in every single case, you were given the benefit of the doubt. And yet, here we are." He turned slowly. "I didn't come here for a lecture." "You came here for control," she said, her tone still calm, but edged now with clarity that left no room for confusion. "And now you're realizing you never really had it." His hand twitched on the gun, just enough to make one of the bailiffs shift behind the far podium, almost by reflex. But Rhodes didn't look at the bailiff. Her eyes remained fixed on Maddox. "You want the truth?" she asked. "Here it is. The badge didn't make you dangerous. It just protected you long enough to believe you weren't." "I was protecting people," Maddox snapped. "I showed up when everyone else ran. I put myself in harm's way, while judges like you sat in wood-paneled rooms. Writing opinions like that made you brave." "No," she said. "What makes me brave is still being here, speaking to you, watching you point a gun at me, and choosing to answer with truth instead of fear." His mouth moved like he wanted to respond, but nothing came, just a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Not respect, not remorse, just confusion, like he couldn't understand why his usual tactics weren't working here. "I used to believe men like you could be reformed," Rhodes said, "that somewhere beneath the uniform there was something redeemable. But I watched your file grow year after year, and every time someone looked the other way, you became more certain that no one would ever hold you accountable." He stepped toward the bench again, slow and heavy-footed. "I said, shut up." "I won't," she said. "You don't get to dictate when I speak. Not here." Outside the chamber, SWAT officers were now at both entrances. The team moved with precision. One squad positioned near the public gallery doors, another at the service entrance beside the clerk's hallway. Carla Nguyen stood at the lead, one hand pressed to her comms, her other hand signaling the team to hold. She listened through the door, eyes narrowed, waiting for the breach order, waiting for the moment that made it unavoidable. Inside, Maddox was beginning to crack. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, lowering the gun just an inch, only to raise it again. "You think that robe makes you powerful. But I've seen what happens when you push a man past his limits. I've been that man." Rhodes tilted her head slightly. "And what did you find on the other side?" He looked at her, puzzled. "What did you find?" she said again. After you pushed past all the rules, all the laws, all the lines you weren't supposed to cross? He didn't answer. Did you find peace? Justice? Or just more excuses? He shook his head. I found out who was really in charge. No, she replied. You found out who stopped pretending you mattered more than everyone else. That made him flinch. Just slightly, but it was enough. The mask was slipping again. His breath came heavier, faster now, his eyes wild but unfocused. And the longer he stood there, the more the room could see it. The rage wasn't righteous anymore. It was hollow. It wasn't about justice. It was about a man terrified that the story he told himself about who he was no longer held weight in a room full of people who had stopped believing it. You don't know what I've seen, he muttered. Maybe not, she said, but I know what you've done. He looked down for the first time since the gun came out. His grip didn't loosen, but the edge of his stance shifted, shoulders sagging, weight leaning back. The crowd remained silent, watching this strange, slow collapse unfold not through violence, but through words that struck deeper than any physical blow could. You should be scared, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Rhodes straightened her shoulders. No, I should be angry. That it took a gun pointed at my head for the world to see what you really are. Outside, Carla gave a silent signal to her team. Almost. They were seconds away now, heartbeat close. But inside, Rhodes hadn't moved. She didn't need to, because every word she spoke brought the walls in tighter. And Maddox was running out of room. There was a rhythm to the silence now, one that pulsed through the room with a nervous heartbeat that everyone could feel, but no one dared acknowledge. Every movement, every breath, every glance felt heavy, as though the very walls of the courtroom were leaning in, waiting for the moment when the weight of the standoff would finally give out. Maddox stood near the jury box, shoulders heaving with each breath, the gun still raised but trembling now, not from fear of what he might do, but from the certainty of what was coming next. Outside, Carla Nguyen moved like a shadow through the back hallway, leading the second SWAT unit toward the service door. The earpiece in her right ear crackled softly as the primary team reported positions locked. Every man and woman under her command had trained for this moment. High-risk breach, armed suspect, civilian presence. But this was no drill. This was the kind of moment where split seconds meant life or death. And the wrong movement meant headlines none of them wanted to read. Carla crouched beside the door, hand resting gently on the handle, the signal line in her palm taut. She didn't speak, didn't blink. Her eyes stayed fixed on the timer in her head, synced with the man just outside the gallery entrance. It wasn't just about entry. It was about precision and timing. Inside, Maddox turned slowly in a circle, facing the gallery one last time, scanning the terrified faces pressed to the floor. His voice came low, almost calm now, like he was already somewhere else. You all think this ends with me in cuffs, he said. You think I'll be dragged out of here and the story will be written clean. Rogue cop brought to justice, right? No one moved. No one answered. Only Rhodes spoke. You're not the one who gets to write the ending. He turned toward her again, eyes narrowed. No, I'm not, he muttered, but maybe I get the last word. He took one step forward, then another. I was supposed to be protected, he said, louder now. I did what I was told. I kept the streets in line. And for what? So people like you could smile on your high horse while I got spit on in mine? You were never asked to abuse your badge, Rhodes answered, voice steady, but you chose to. And when the system gave you a second chance, you made it worse. He raised the gun higher, hand shaking now, not from nerves, but from the weight of knowing the window was closing. Outside, Carla raised her fingers, 3, 2, 1, and dropped them fast. The breach was instant. Both doors burst open at once, wooden frames crashing against the walls as black-clad officers surged into the room with tactical precision, rifles raised, shields forward, commands echoing in clipped shouts. Drop the weapon, "Get down! Hands where we can see them." Maddox froze, not from fear, but from realization. His eyes went wide. He didn't move to fire. Not yet. He just looked around, watching the swarm of officers closing in from both sides, each one moving in perfect formation, weapons locked on him with deadly purpose. He took one shaky step back, gun still raised, as if trying to retreat into a corner that no longer existed. "You think you win now?" he said, his voice suddenly cracking. "You think this fixes anything?" Rhodes stood slowly behind the bench, her hands never moving far, her expression unchanged. "This isn't about winning," she said. "This is about ending what should have ended a long time ago." And for a second, just a breath, he looked like he might surrender. His gaze dropped, his body slackened. The gun lowered just a few inches, but then he looked at her, and something in him snapped. He raised the weapon one last time and aimed it straight at the bench. And he fired. The sound of the gunshot cracked through the courtroom like a lightning strike, sharp and brutal and final, cutting through the shouting and commands with terrifying clarity. Time didn't slow, it shattered. The SWAT officers surged forward, but in that one moment, between the flash of the muzzle and the echo still bouncing off the marble walls, every single person in the room felt the same terrible question bloom in their minds. Had she been hit? Judge Rhodes didn't fall. She didn't cry out. She didn't even stagger. She stood behind the bench exactly where she had been before the shot rang out, her robe unshaken, her expression hard to read. One of the bailiffs gasped, stepping toward her without thinking, only to stop when she lifted her hand slowly. Not in pain, not in panic, but in control. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice, though quieter than it had been, cut through the noise like a commandment. He missed. Behind her, embedded in the mahogany panel of the bench, just inches to her right, a dark hole smoked quietly. The grain of the wood split and blackened around it. 1 inch closer, and the bullet would have passed through her chest, but it hadn't. And now it was over. Maddox didn't get a second shot. The moment the recoil sent his arm back, the first officer reached him from the right flank, slamming into his side with a shield and driving him backward into the jury box. Another officer followed, grabbing his gun hand and twisting it upward as 2 more moved in behind, forcing him down with brutal efficiency. He didn't resist. There was no fight left in him. His face hit the floor, one arm pinned under a knee, the other pulled behind his back as metal cuffs clicked tight around his wrists. One of the SWAT team's boots kicked the gun away. Far, hard, clattering across the floor until it stopped at the foot of the prosecution's table. Carla Nguyen was the last one through the door, stepping over the edge of the breach line just as the chaos died. She looked straight at Rhodes, then at Maddox, who was still breathing hard into the floor, face pressed to the polished wood. The fire in him finally burned down to ash. "Suspect is secured," one officer called out. "Medical team on standby," another said behind her. Carla moved closer to the bench. "Judge Rhodes," she said cautiously, "are you sure you're not hurt?" Rhodes nodded once, her breath finally coming back into rhythm. "I'm sure." But when she looked down at the bullet hole in the bench, her hand briefly hovered over it, not trembling, not shaken, just acknowledging it, like marking a place where the world almost split. She turned back toward the room, scanning the faces still crouched behind benches, under desks, along the walls. A reporter in the second row still held her phone up, recording without even realizing her fingers had locked. The court clerk was crying softly but trying to hide it. A bailiff was calling out names to check for injuries. There was blood, none of it hers, but a gash on the forearm of one SWAT officer where splinters from the bench had hit during the shot. She spoke again, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a voice that recentered the entire space. "Everyone can rise. The immediate danger has passed." People began to move slowly, uncertainly, like survivors stepping out of wreckage, unsure of what still might fall. Maddox had been lifted to his knees now, his wrists cuffed behind him, his face bruised from where it had hit the floor. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't speak. His silence now was not a choice. It was all that was left. Rhodes came down from the bench. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She simply moved, as if every step mattered more now, as if the air around her had grown heavier, but her spine had only straightened. She stopped in front of him. He didn't raise his head, and she didn't offer him the dignity of a word. Instead, she turned to Carla. "I want a full record pulled," she said. "Every complaint, every case he touched, everything the department kept off paper." "We're already on it," Carla answered, her voice low. "I've got 2 officers scrubbing internal files now." "Good. I want eyes on every name that signed off on his performance reviews. I'll make sure it happens." Rhodes looked back toward the gallery, where the press had already begun composing headlines in their minds. "This isn't over," she said, not to the cameras, not to the court, but to herself. "This is where it starts." And with that, she walked past Maddox, past the shattered illusion of control he had built around himself, past the smoking hole in the bench he thought would silence her, and out through the same doors she had entered from at the beginning of the day. Only now, she was carrying something far heavier than a gavel. She was carrying the truth, and this time it was going to make noise. The courthouse was quieter the next day, but it was not calm. Where there had once been whispers of scandal and passive interest in a routine misconduct trial, there was now a storm of flashing cameras, reporters calling out names, and courthouse staff moving with the urgency of people who understood the weight of what had just happened. The glass doors at the front of the building were marked with fingerprints and smudges, from the crush of media that had gathered before sunrise, hoping to get a glimpse of the judge, the shooter, or the growing fallout that had already begun to spread. But Judge Rhodes didn't come through the front. She entered through the side, her head low, coat buttoned to the collar, and a plain folder tucked beneath her arm. No robe, no escort, just quiet purpose. The folder held the first 20 pages of Maddox's internal record, what little of it had ever been made official. Redacted complaints, suspended reviews, a handful of citizen reports marked resolved without explanation. It wasn't enough to build anything solid. Not yet. But it was enough to confirm what she already knew. Someone had been protecting him. She stepped into her chambers and closed the door behind her. The light overhead buzzed faintly, and the clock on the wall clicked forward with a sound she usually ignored, but now couldn't stop hearing. She sat down, spread the file across her desk, and began to read. The first report was dated 2014, 8 years earlier. Excessive force during a traffic stop. A 17-year-old boy hospitalized with a fractured orbital bone and bruised ribs. No video footage. The complaint had been dismissed within 3 days. The reviewing officer had been a name she recognized, Captain Roland Bowers, now retired, once praised for keeping internal affairs efficient and quiet. The second report came from 2016. Body cam footage missing from a domestic disturbance call. The department claimed the equipment had malfunctioned. Rhodes made a note beside it in pen. Check equipment logs. The third was filed in 2018. This one anonymous, submitted by someone inside the department. It accused Maddox of targeting black residents in routine patrols, escalating minor stops into arrests, and manipulating evidence reports after the fact. The complaint was unsigned. The investigation never began. She stared at that page longer than the others. Then she reached for the phone. "Get me Tiffany Hall," she said, when her clerk answered. "Tell her I'm ready to talk." It didn't take long. The young reporter had been covering courthouse assignments for years, but this was the first time the judge had ever called her directly. She arrived with a notebook in hand and her phone already recording. "I'm not giving you a press statement," Rhodes said as soon as she walked in. "This is not about headlines. I want the record put together, fully, chronologically. Everything public, everything they buried." Tiffany sat down, eyes wide, and nodded. "I've already pulled some of the older reports," she said. "There are patterns, but they're hard to see without the internal files." "I have some of them," Rhodes said, "and I'm going to get the rest." The reporter looked at her, uncertain. "How?" "The department's not going to open its doors just because you asked." "They won't have a choice," Rhodes replied. "Not after what happened. Not with this much light on them now." By the end of the day, they had a full board sketched across the judge's back wall. Dates, names, complaint numbers, and empty spaces that marked the parts still hidden. It wasn't just Maddox. The same investigators kept showing up in multiple reviews, the same supervisors who marked serious incidents as no action needed. It formed a quiet chain, thin but unbroken, winding its way through a department that had learned how to erase problems without ever solving them. Carla Nguyen arrived that evening with her own folder in hand. "I brought everything we could pull without a warrant," she said, dropping the file beside the growing pile. "It's worse than I thought." Rhodes looked up. "Go on." "There are overlaps," Carla said. "Maddox wasn't just protected, he was moved. Every time something serious happened, he was reassigned. 3 precincts in 5 years, each one farther out from oversight, each one with fewer questions asked. And no discipline." Carla shook her head. "A few letters in his file. Probably just for show, but nothing that stuck." Rhodes stood slowly and moved to the wall, eyes scanning the chart they had built. "I want everyone connected to his performance reviews flagged," she said. "Supervisors, training officers, complaint investigators. I want their records opened and cross-checked." "I'll get started," Carla said. "But if you're planning to go public with this, you're going to make enemies fast." Rhodes didn't hesitate. "I'm not worried about enemies," she said. "I'm worried about silence." Carla watched her for a moment, then nodded. When she left, Rhodes stood alone in the room, facing the wall of reports and red lines, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The bullet hole in the bench upstairs had been patched, but the image still lingered in her mind. How close it had come, how quickly it had all turned. How much of this had been hidden beneath polite court decorum for years. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt awake. The next step would be harder. She knew that. This wasn't about one man anymore. This was about the system that kept his hands clean and his badge shiny long after he should have been stopped. And she was going to drag every name, every signature, and every silence into the light, one by one. The holding facility sat just south of the city, past the courthouse and beyond the quiet sprawl of government buildings that always looked emptier than they were. From the outside, the structure was plain, just beige walls, narrow windows, and a tall chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. But inside, it was dense with rules, echoes, and the dull throb of fluorescent light that never truly dimmed. It was the kind of place designed not to punish, but to grind down the hours until punishment became a form of routine. Judge Rhodes arrived without announcement, without a press escort, and without security detail. She carried only a manila folder in her hand and the same steady calm that had become her signature. The officer at the gate didn't ask why she was there. He didn't need to. Everyone in the building already knew. Maddox was waiting in the visitor's room when she entered, seated on the far side of the table, one wrist cuffed to the bolted steel bracket that jutted from the floor. He was dressed in standard-issue beige, and though he hadn't been there long, the weight of confinement had already started to show. His beard was growing in uneven. His posture had changed. The anger was still there, but it no longer sat on top of him. It had sunk deeper now, closer to bone. He looked up when she walked in, and though his mouth twisted into something that might have once passed for a smile, his eyes were dull and hard. "Well, well," he said. "The great Vanessa Rhodes. Come to gloat?" She sat across from him without flinching. "I don't gloat." "Right," he said, chuckling low in his throat. "You're the noble kind. The robe-wearing queen of justice, just making sure the world knows how brave you are." She opened the folder but didn't look down at it yet. "You're going away for a long time. You know that. He leaned back as far as the cuff would let him, his free hand resting flat on the table. You think I don't know how this ends? They'll bury me, throw away the key, make me the face of every bad cop in the country. Like I built this system myself. You didn't build it, she said, but you lived off it. And now, you're going to help tear it down, he scoffed. You really think I'm going to help you? I don't need your help, she said. I already have your file. I have your disciplinary reports. I have the names of every officer who signed off on your behavior, every supervisor who buried a complaint, every training officer who passed you despite the warnings. And one by one, they're going to answer for it. Maddox tilted his head, smiling again. So you want to be a crusader now? Big cleanup act. Wipe the whole slate. Except you and I both know the truth, Judge. Nobody really wants the slate clean. They just want to feel better while the dirt's still there. That might have been true before, she said. But you changed that the moment you pulled that gun. He leaned forward, the metal cuff scraping against the bracket as he moved. You act like I'm the disease. But I was the cure. You think those neighborhoods stayed quiet because of community programs? No. They stayed quiet because I made them quiet. She didn't blink. You terrorized people. You escalated every situation until someone bled. And now that you're on the other side of the table, you're still calling it order. He grinned, but it didn't touch his eyes. You don't belong on that bench. You never did. You got there because of politics, not principle. Affirmative action in a robe. That's what this whole damn thing is. A show. Rhodes didn't look away. You're trying to insult me. But all you're doing is confirming what we already knew. You didn't hate me because I ruled against you. You hated me before I even opened my mouth. Damn right, he said. Because people like you don't belong in charge. You don't understand what it's like to be out there. To be the only line between law and chaos. You were the chaos, she said softly. And now, people will see that. He stared at her, jaw tight. She opened the folder now, laying out a few pages. Copies of old reviews, black and white photos, written statements from whistleblowers whose names had never seen daylight before this week. Your precinct's internal review board was compromised. 2 of your supervisors retired quietly after complaints came through. One of them is still drawing a pension. Another transferred out of state. He glanced at the papers but didn't respond. They're next, she said. Every name connected to yours. Every officer who covered for you, ignored what you did, or signed their name to a lie so they could keep their unit numbers clean. They're all going to fall. Big words, he muttered. Not words, she said. Process. He shook his head slowly, the weight of it all sinking in despite himself. You think any of this really changes anything? It already has, she replied. You used to be a cop who thought the badge made him untouchable. Now you're just a man in a cage. He laughed again, but this time it sounded thin, even to him. You want the truth, Judge? He asked, voice dropping low. The real reason I did what I did? It wasn't about the trial. It wasn't about justice. I just couldn't stand the thought of being judged by someone like you. You, sitting up there? Like you earned it. She stood then, calmly closing the folder and lifting it under one arm. I did earn it, she said, voice quiet, but firm. And now I'm going to earn something else. Accountability. Real accountability. Not just for you, but for every man who sat beside you, nodding along, every one of them who thought your hatred was just part of the job. She turned and walked toward the door. He called after her. One last time. You'll never clean it all up. It's too big, too deep. She paused at the door and looked back over her shoulder, eyes steady. Then I'll dig deeper. And she left him there, alone, cuffed to a table, surrounded by the silence he once mistook for power, as the walls around him began to close for good. The story broke 3 days later. It wasn't sensational, and it didn't lead with the headline most expected. There were no capital letters shouting about a disgraced officer or courtroom chaos. Instead, it was a quiet, surgical article published under Tiffany Hall's byline, nestled into the front page of the city's most read digital news outlet, and it began with a question. How does a man with 12 misconduct complaints, 3 formal use of force allegations, and missing footage in half a dozen cases stay in uniform for over a decade? The answer came not in accusations, but in details. Real names, real dates, quiet transfers, buried reports. The piece didn't focus on Maddox himself. It focused on the chain. One supervisor had retired early and left the state. Another was promoted to a training position and quietly reassigned after an internal audit that no one could now seem to find. Internal Affairs, it seemed, had mishandled at least 5 of the cases tied to Maddox, some of which had never even made it to the review board. The public response wasn't loud at first. It was cautious, but by midday, the article had spread far beyond Charleston. By evening, Rhodes's chambers had received over 24 requests from state officials, legal analysts, and national journalists asking whether a formal inquiry was being opened. She didn't answer them. Not yet. She had already begun. The wall in her office had changed. What began as a simple sketch of connections had grown into a full layout of names, photos, and review documents. Red lines traced the movements of key players, chiefs, commanders, union representatives. The more she read, the more she understood the pattern. Maddox was only the visible tip of something deeper, an entire structure of men who learned how to keep their records clean, not by doing their jobs better, but by learning which doors to close and which voices to ignore. Carla stood beside her, arms folded, scanning the board with a look that had grown more focused each day. "We found the clearance memo from the 2018 traffic stop," she said. "The one where Maddox tackled the teenager into the sidewalk. They claimed the body cam malfunctioned." "And did it?" Rhodes asked. "No. The footage was never uploaded because the officer assigned to it flagged the incident as unremarkable before the system auto-synced. They used a loophole that allows delay if the footage is non-essential." Rhodes shook her head. "How many others used that same loophole?" "Too many," Carla said. "We're sorting through them now, but they all tie back to the same internal affairs supervisor, Captain James Keller." "Keller," Rhodes repeated. "I've seen his name 3 times this week." 4, Carla corrected. "We found one more this morning." Rhodes stepped back from the board, looking at the red lines, at how often they led to Keller's name, and how many reports he signed off on without further review. Her eyes moved to another corner of the board, where Tiffany had tacked up copies of scanned emails. Communications between precinct leads and district officials discussing optics, liability risk, and one phrase that stood out more than the rest. "If Maddox makes another mistake, we need to get ahead of it this time." They had known. They hadn't just missed signs. They had prepared for the fallout, weighed the damage, and let him keep going anyway. Later that afternoon, Tiffany arrived again, this time with a flash drive in her hand and a look on her face that told Rhodes she hadn't come just to talk. "I've got 3 more whistleblowers," she said, sitting down without waiting for permission. 2 of them are still on the force. One's a retired dispatcher who was asked to reroute complaint calls in 2017. All of them say the same thing. It wasn't just Maddox. It was procedure. It was protection. Rhodes leaned forward. "Can they testify?" "Eventually. They're nervous, but they're watching what happens next. They want to see if anyone gets held accountable first." "They will," Rhodes said. "Starting now." That evening, she drafted the first formal memo to the State Commission on Judicial and Law Enforcement Conduct, requesting immediate administrative holds on 5 current officers pending review. She named Keller among them, and attached evidence from his pattern of sign-offs, failure to escalate reviews, and refusal to act on multiple early warning flags. She sent the memo without copying the department heads. The next morning, she received a terse reply from the district attorney's office. "This is premature. The officer in question is not under criminal investigation. These matters should be reviewed internally before external requests are filed." She read the email twice, then deleted it. Later that day, She walked into a closed-door meeting with the district attorney himself. Leonard Price, a man with careful suits, measured words, and a long habit of staying exactly 1 inch ahead of public outrage. "I've seen the memo," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm not here to ask your permission," Rhodes replied. "Vanessa, let's be reasonable," he said, voice low. "You're making a lot of noise, going public with internal failures, demanding files without protocol. This is going to turn into a political mess." "It already is one," she said. "And if you'd done your job the first time I flagged Maddox's record last year, we wouldn't be sitting here now." Price exhaled slowly, the kind of breath meant to sound thoughtful, but came off like stalling. "You're pushing this too fast." "No," Rhodes said, rising. "I'm moving at exactly the speed justice demands." And before he could respond, she turned and left. Outside his office, her clerk handed her a printed copy of Tiffany's second article, just published an hour earlier. The headline was simple: "Not just one badge, how a city protected its worst officers." It had already been shared 15,000 times. And by the end of the day, a state oversight committee had scheduled a public hearing. The circle was closing, but Rhodes wasn't finished. She had just started tightening the rope. The hearing room inside the state capitol wasn't designed for spectacle. The wood-paneled walls, the sun-faded flags, the slightly crooked state seal above the head table, all of it gave the space a dry, bureaucratic feel, the kind of place where decisions were usually made behind closed doors and announced only when they could no longer be ignored. But on this day, every seat was filled before noon. Lines wrapped around the hallway outside, camera crews stacked tripods on top of one another, reporters jostled for sound checks, and families, some of them long ignored, some long forgotten, came holding photos and documents that hadn't mattered to anyone in power until now. Judge Rhodes sat in the front row, not behind the bench, not speaking as a jurist, but listening as a citizen. She hadn't asked to speak during the first session. She didn't need to. The voices that followed her work were already speaking loudly enough. The first testimony came from a mother whose son had been arrested at age 16 during a stop conducted by Maddox and another officer still on the force. She told the panel how the arrest report didn't match the hospital records, how the city never returned the body cam footage, how her complaint had been dismissed within 2 weeks and marked closed due to insufficient evidence. She held up the medical photos. She didn't cry. The second witness was a retired patrol officer, small in stature but steady in voice. He had worked 2 precincts over from Maddox's last post. His testimony detailed how officers were routinely coached to avoid formal write-ups. He described the way complaints were filtered, first through a department liaison, then through a back-channel review process meant to keep problems internal. His voice cracked once, only when he mentioned the calls he hadn't returned to a victim's family. By the time the fourth witness took the stand, a woman who had once served as an administrative clerk in internal affairs, the room was silent in a way no courtroom ever could be. She brought emails, signed review slips, and one audio recording where 2 department heads discussed how to bury a misconduct case by reassigning it to a cleaner file. No one interrupted her. No one dared. By the time the session ended, the committee had called for a recess, and the chair, a soft-spoken woman from Columbia who rarely commented on ongoing matters, requested a private meeting with Rhodes before the next hearing date. They met in a side chamber, away from cameras. "You've shaken something loose," the chair said, "and now it's coming apart faster than any of us expected." Rhodes nodded. "It needed to. There are names on these files we didn't even know were still active," the chair continued. "Supervisors who retired on full pensions. Officers who now work in training academies. If even half of what's been documented here holds up under legal review, this isn't just misconduct, it's conspiracy." "Then treat it like one," Rhodes said. The chair hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We're going to subpoena the rest of the internal records." "Start with Keller," Rhodes replied. Then the union reps who approved his sign-offs. Then every precinct chief who reassigned Maddox instead of suspending him. If you move in the right order, The rest will fold under pressure. That night, back in her office, Rhodes stood before the wall of red lines and documents. Carla had added new printouts, email records from the mayor's office, now under review for ignoring citizen complaints flagged by civil rights groups. Tiffany had posted an early draft of her next article on the corner of the whiteboard. The headline read, "How the City Paid to Stay Quiet." The subheading told the rest. 32 settlements, nearly $3 million, and a silence clause in every one. Rhodes exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the names. She thought of the court clerk who had sat frozen behind her desk the day Maddox pulled the gun. She thought of the mother who had held her son's medical photos like they were evidence in a case no one ever opened. She thought of the officer who had called Maddox a liability 3 years ago and was quietly transferred to a desk job in records. She thought of all the voices that had whispered in the dark, not because they were cowards, but because no one had ever handed them a microphone. Now, the microphone was live, and for the first time, people were listening. The following morning, Rhodes received a call from the governor's office. It was short and polite and political. "We'd like to schedule a briefing." She didn't ask what for. She already knew. Later that afternoon, 3 department heads announced early retirements. Internal Affairs suspended all pending disciplinary reviews and issued a statement saying that an external audit of prior oversight will be conducted by an independent task force. The union released a carefully worded message calling for a return to procedural fairness and respect for officers who serve honorably. But the streets were speaking louder. Protests formed outside City Hall, peaceful, focused, steady. Not wild outbursts of rage, but a clear demand for answers. People carried signs with names, not slogans. Names of men and women who were arrested, hurt, or silenced over the past 10 years under the protection of officers like Maddox. And Rhodes watched it all from her office window, her arms folded, her gaze unreadable. She had never wanted fame. She had never wanted recognition. She wanted accountability, and it was finally coming. Not in a headline, not in a verdict, but in the unraveling. And there was still more to pull loose. The hearing room was full again, not just with families and reporters this time, but with officials. Suits freshly pressed, expressions tense, words rehearsed. The district attorney sat at the edge of the head table, flanked by 2 department heads and a legal advisor whose name had not appeared in any of the press releases, but whose signature was quietly stamped across half a dozen review decisions from the past 10 years. A deputy police chief sat 2 rows back, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The gallery behind them was lined with citizens, lawyers, civil rights organizers, and state observers. A few held up printed screenshots of internal emails. Others held names on white placards, the black ink bold and steady. Judge Vanessa Rhodes entered last, this time without her robe, wearing a black suit with no jewelry and no need for introduction. When she took the witness seat, the room fell into the kind of hush that didn't come from rules, but from respect. Genuine, quiet, and growing louder by the day. The chair of the Oversight Committee leaned forward. "Judge Rhodes, thank you for joining us again. We understand you've submitted additional records since the last session. Would you like to begin with a summary?" Rhodes didn't reach for notes. "I've submitted documentation connecting 8 officers to falsified reports, 5 supervisors to cleared misconduct files that were never reviewed by independent investigators, and 2 assistant DAs who approved case dismissals without notifying complainants," she said. "All of them connect back to Officer Brent Maddox. But none of them stop with him." She turned slightly, her eyes landing on Leonard Price. "The district attorney's office received notice of pattern misconduct tied to Maddox nearly a year ago. That notice was acknowledged and dismissed. The department claims it was not significant. Yet, since that dismissal, we've uncovered video suppression, settlement agreements with gag orders, and internal guidance on how to frame complaints to limit legal exposure. Price didn't blink. He sat with his fingers steepled in front of him, like he was waiting for the storm to pass without getting wet. The chair looked down at her notes. "Mr. Price, would you like to respond?" He leaned into the microphone, his voice careful. "Our office takes allegations of misconduct seriously. We rely on department-generated evidence to move forward on cases. If officers or internal investigators failed to follow procedure, that is a failure we intend to address." Rhodes didn't wait. "You didn't address it when it was brought to you last year, or the year before, or when community groups submitted documented concerns about specific officers being reassigned after violent arrests. You waited until a gun was drawn in a courtroom and your department was forced into the light. I understand your frustration." "No, you don't," she said, "because frustration is what comes when someone ignores your voice. What this is, what they've lived with, is abandonment. You abandoned your responsibility. You allowed convenience to overtake accountability. And now, the public is paying the price for your comfort." Price shifted slightly in his seat. The silence around him wasn't defensive. It was watching. The chair intervened gently. "Judge Rhodes, would you support a full independent review of every case handled by the officers named in your report?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "And I would also recommend temporary suspension of all internal review authority within the department until that audit is complete." "That's a drastic recommendation." "What happened in that courtroom was drastic," she said. "What allowed it to happen was worse." The committee called a brief recess, but no one left the room. When the gavel fell, it sounded like a breath being held, and when it rose again, the tone of the hearing had shifted. Rhodes remained seated as the next witnesses were called. A former assistant DA who described pressure to decline civil rights complaints unless they posed an immediate liability, and a precinct commander who admitted on record that problem officers were often reassigned quietly rather than reported to avoid disruption in morale. By the end of the day, the committee issued 2 immediate resolutions. The first called for a freeze on new hiring within the Charleston Police Department, pending review of their training protocols. The second demanded the resignation of Captain James Keller and launched an ethics inquiry into the district attorney's failure to act on prior warnings. That evening, Tiffany Hall stood outside the courthouse on camera as the crowd behind her began to swell. "Today, accountability gained a name," she said. "Not just Brent Maddox, but the names of those who protected him, enabled him, and turned away when others tried to speak. And for the first time, those names are being read aloud in places that once refused to hear them." Inside her office, Judge Rhodes sat alone, reading the final copy of the day's transcripts. Carla entered with a folder under her arm and quiet in her step. "It's moving faster now," she said, placing the folder on the desk. "The unions issued a private statement to its members warning of deep structural review. The commissioner is scheduled to appear before the committee next week, and 3 more officers filed early retirement today." Rhodes didn't smile. "This isn't cleanup," she said. "It's exposure. The real work hasn't even started yet." Carla nodded. "Then we keep going." The judge leaned back, the sounds of protest chants faint through the window behind her. Steady, rhythmic, louder than before. Not angry, just certain. It wasn't justice yet, but it was the beginning of something that finally looked like it could become justice. And this time, no one was going to stop it. The city tried one last time to hold the line. It began with a quiet meeting behind closed doors, unannounced, undocumented, but not unnoticed. Rhodes heard about it the following morning from a clerk who had overheard the wrong person on the wrong phone call. The district attorney, the deputy commissioner, and 2 senior aides to the mayor had gathered late into the night inside a sealed office on the 5th floor of City Hall, discussing what they referred to as narrative stabilization. The term, sterile as it sounded, meant one thing: containment. The district attorney, the deputy commissioner, and 2 senior aides to the mayor had gathered late into the night inside a sealed office on the 5th floor of City Hall. discussing what they referred to as narrative stabilization. The term, sterile as it sounded, meant one thing: containment. Not reform, not accountability, control. They knew they couldn't undo what had happened in that courtroom. They couldn't erase the hearings, the articles, or the resignations that had begun stacking up like dominoes in a city that had, for too long, insisted the board wasn't even real. But they were still trying to shape what came next. They hoped, perhaps, that the momentum would slow, that the crowds would shrink, that the public's attention would drift the way it so often did, when real change took more than headlines. But that week, the crowd didn't shrink. It doubled, then tripled. What had started as scattered signs and cautious voices had grown into full blocks of people standing shoulder to shoulder, not yelling, not throwing, just being present. Firm, unbending, the way institutions had always assumed only they could be. And inside her chambers, Rhodes prepared for what she knew would be her most watched appearance yet. The special session of the State Oversight Committee was held in a university auditorium to accommodate the attendance requests. Every seat was filled before the hour, every stairwell crowded with bodies, every exit flanked by officers, not to suppress the gathering, but to protect the process. No one in that room had forgotten how it started. No one had forgotten the sound of a gunshot in a courtroom, or the judge who refused to duck. The commissioner testified first. He stood at the center podium and read from a prepared statement, speaking of reform, of new procedures, of oversight committees and transparency initiatives. He cited numbers, projections, percentages of reduction in complaint processing time. He avoided the word failure. He never said Maddox's name. When he finished, Rhodes rose. She took the same podium, but did not read from notes. "There's a reason people don't trust numbers anymore," she began. "It's because for years, the same officials who speak of policy have used statistics to mask harm. They measure progress in how quickly they can close a case, not whether they resolved it honestly. They measure safety by how little noise makes it to the public, not how much damage was done beneath the silence." The commissioner stared ahead, his mouth fixed into something meant to resemble neutrality, but the muscles in his jaw twitched just enough to betray it. Rhodes continued. "You didn't lose control of the public," she said. "You lost their belief that you were ever in control for the right reasons." Then she opened a folder and laid it on the podium. Printed statements, leaked memos, and formal grievances that had been ignored. She read a paragraph aloud. It was from an officer who had tried to file a complaint about Maddox 6 years ago. His file had been quietly reassigned. His request was buried. The complaint was marked resolved, and he was warned not to press it further. "You marked his truth resolved because it was easier than confronting your own," she said, turning slightly to face the rows of officials seated behind her. "That stops now." The applause was not loud, but it was long. And when it faded, the committee chair asked a question that everyone had been circling. "Judge Rhodes, if the recommendations you've submitted are approved, what comes next?" Rhodes looked out over the crowd, not at the cameras, not at the officials, but at the people seated in folding chairs and standing along the walls. Teachers, nurses, transit workers, teenagers holding their parents' hands, retired veterans, students in city college sweatshirts. The people who had kept showing up when the institutions said it was too late. She answered simply. "We rebuild," she said, "with the truth at the foundation this time." That evening, the news didn't break. It surged. Not just in Charleston, not just in the state. National anchors read her words on air. Editorials began appearing within hours. Calls for inquiry reached departments in other cities. And still, Rhodes stayed off camera. She didn't accept interviews. She didn't host conferences. She walked into her office early the next morning, same as she had the morning before Maddox's trial began. The robe on the hanger, the same desk, the same window. But the city outside had changed. It was louder now. Not in sound, but in awareness. Later that day, The committee voted to approve every one of her recommendations. 37 officers and officials were placed under formal review. Internal Affairs was dissolved and scheduled to be rebuilt under an independent civilian board. And Leonard Price, once considered the untouchable gatekeeper of city justice, resigned quietly before sunset. The foundations had cracked, but they hadn't collapsed. Not yet. Rhodes stood at the edge of the courthouse steps that evening, watching the people gather again, their signs lifted higher now, not out of rage, but out of insistence, not asking any more, demanding, and this time no one was turning away. The courtroom looked different now, not in layout. The same benches lined the gallery, the same polished rail divided observers from the trial floor, and the same creak of old wood followed every step made across its surface. But something deeper had changed. Something in the air, in the posture of those who sat watching, in the weight that once rested on silence, now replaced by a stillness that felt earned, not forced. Brent Maddox stood at the defense table in a plain suit, hands clasped in front of him. No badge, no supporters seated behind him, no remaining illusion of power. His face, thinner now, had none of the smugness it once carried, only the stillness of someone who had run out of room and could no longer pretend he hadn't. Judge Rhodes did not preside. She sat in the gallery, a quiet presence in a row filled with community leaders, former complainants, and journalists who had followed the story from the moment it left the courtroom in handcuffs and spread across a city that no longer agreed to look away. The case had been swift. The evidence had never been lacking. The footage, the weapon, the eyewitnesses, the intent. What had taken time was no longer proving guilt. It was finally acknowledging it. The prosecutor delivered closing arguments that required no embellishment. Maddox had pulled a firearm inside a federal courtroom. He had aimed it at a sitting judge. He had discharged it in front of over 30 witnesses. That alone would have secured a conviction. But the weight of what came after, the hearings, the investigations, the victims stepping forward with stories long buried, that added a context the jury could not ignore. When the foreperson stood and read the verdict, there was no gasp, no shouts, no outbursts. Only a quiet exhale. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder of a federal judge. Brandishing a weapon in a secured government building. Assault with a deadly weapon. Terroristic threats. Resisting lawful arrest. Federal obstruction. He would not be eligible for parole. The sentencing hearing would follow in 60 days, but everyone in that room already knew. He would not walk free again. Rhodes did not shift in her seat. She did not smile. She did not close her eyes or bow her head. She simply watched, just as she had watched him the day he first pulled the gun, unmoved by the noise and unmoved by the silence, her focus resting on the truth of the moment and the work still ahead. After the verdict, no one rushed to the courthouse steps. There were no camera flashes bursting through the double doors. Instead, there was a different kind of response. Calm, grounded, organized. Outside, a group from a local advocacy organization passed out printed lists of new city reform policies. At the front of the building, a crowd of school teachers who had marched weeks earlier stood in line to sign a petition for expanded community review boards. And along the sidewalk, where protesters once held signs demanding justice, now stood volunteers from a new task force, gathering names of residents interested in participating in public safety roundtables. The shift was real. It was still forming, still fragile, but it was real. Inside her office later that day, Rhodes sat behind her desk, reading over the draft charter for the Civilian Review Board. Carla had left it there earlier with a note. This is what we said we'd reach. We're almost there. Tiffany's latest article had gone live that morning. It didn't lead with Maddox's name. It led with someone else's, the judge who didn't flinch. How Vanessa Rhodes helped turn a city toward accountability. The piece was long, deliberate, like her courtroom. It told the full story, not just of the incident, but of the years before it. The silence, the failures, and the steady hand that refused to let fear speak louder than responsibility. Rhodes had refused all interview requests, but Tiffany's article didn't need direct quotes. It told the story through impact. Later that evening, Rhodes received a call from Washington. The voice on the other end belonged to a U.S. senator who served on the National Judicial Reform Committee. "We've been following what's happened in Charleston. The hearings, the votes, the outcome." Rhodes listened, but said nothing. "We're putting together a task force, federal level. Judges, civil rights attorneys, former prosecutors. We'd like your insight, your leadership, if you're willing." She didn't answer immediately. She turned and looked out the tall window of her office, the city beneath her glowing orange from the last light of day. Below, traffic hummed, voices carried, and the hum of ordinary life continued, but different now, not untouched, just more aware. Finally, she said, "Send me the details." The call ended soon after. She stayed at the window for a long time, not thinking of herself, not thinking of Maddox. She thought about the people who had come forward, the names on the signs, the faces that kept showing up even when the weather turned cold and the cameras moved on. The silence that had once been the city's greatest defense, now replaced by a new, louder kind of stillness, one that did not come from fear, but from watching, listening, remembering. Maddox had fallen. But more importantly, the shield that had once protected men like him had cracked wide open. And now the rebuilding could begin. The courthouse lobby was still. Not empty. Staff moved with their usual purpose. Security stood at their posts, and visitors checked in with folded papers and quiet questions, but still in a way that felt grounded. The building no longer buzzed with nerves or suspicion. The tension that had once settled into its corners like dust had been cleared out by weeks of testimony, by headlines that refused to soften, by citizens who no longer asked permission to be heard. A mural now lined the north-facing wall near the main entrance. It hadn't been commissioned through the city or painted by any professional artist. It had started with chalk, one name scrawled beneath the seal in block letters, left behind by a teenager who had stood on the courthouse steps every Saturday with her mother. The chalk had faded, but others came after. Someone brought markers, then paint. Eventually, one of the custodians asked the judge if they should remove it. She had told them no, not yet. Now the wall held dozens of names, not just those who had been hurt, but those who had stood, those who had spoken when it would have been easier to walk away, officers who testified against their own, witnesses who came forward without legal protection, clerks who flagged documents that had been buried, citizens who showed up even when they weren't sure it would matter. That morning, Rhodes passed the wall on her way in. She didn't stop, not because it didn't matter, but because it was no longer about her. The names didn't orbit around the badge or the bench. They stood on their own now, and that, more than any ruling or resolution, told her what had changed. Inside her chambers, she reviewed the final draft of the Civilian Oversight Board's charter. The governor had approved it. Funding had been secured. Recruitment would begin within the week. But what struck her most wasn't the signatures or the budget. It was the language. Clear, unfiltered language about transparency, whistleblower protections, independent investigations, and most of all, enforceable authority. There were no loopholes, no vague promises, just structure, grounded, firm, and long overdue. Carla stopped by before noon, as she often did now. She brought with her a new set of reports, cases from other cities that had begun revisiting their own complaint structures after Charleston's hearings had gained national attention. Departments that had gone untouched for decades were now under review. Some were resisting, some were already reforming, but the ripple had started. "They're asking if you'll speak in Chicago next month," Carla said, placing the file down gently. "And Baltimore, and possibly L.A., depending on the vote that just went through." Rhodes didn't answer right away. She flipped through one of the reports. A familiar name caught her eye. An officer from a prior case, now under new review thanks to a witness who came forward citing Charleston's example. After a moment, she said, "Let them know, I'll think about it." Carla nodded, understanding the weight behind the simplicity of the answer. Later that afternoon, Rhodes stepped outside alone. The city was quieter than it had been in weeks, but not hushed, just more focused, like it was learning to listen differently. She walked a few blocks without destination, passing coffee shops and small storefronts where televisions played news reports with muted sound and closed captions. At a corner near the edge of the park, she paused. A group of high school students stood in a loose circle, holding clipboards and passing out flyers. Their shirts read, "Know Your Rights," in bold letters. One of them, a girl no older than 16, turned and saw her. "You're the judge, right?" Rhodes nodded. The girl didn't look nervous. "Thanks for not backing down," she said. "We talk about you in civics class now. We're doing a whole project on the hearings." Rhodes offered a quiet smile. "Make sure they teach you the full story, not just the verdict." "They are," the girl said. "Our teacher says justice isn't just about outcomes. It's about process, about who stays standing when it gets hard." Rhodes nodded again, this time slower. "Then you've got the right teacher." She walked on after that, not because the moment needed to end, but because it had landed exactly where it needed to. As evening settled across the city, the lights of the courthouse came on, bathing the front steps in a soft amber glow. From a distance, it looked the same as it always had, tall, solid, rooted. But for those who had stood inside it, or beside it, or outside with signs in their hands and conviction in their voices, it would never look quite the same again. Because this time, the cracks hadn't been painted over. They had been named, and the rebuilding had begun from the inside out. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.